Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to How Climate Won in the US election. We'll give people a few minutes to join. And while we do that, I'll offer a few housekeeping items. So my name is Amber Bennett, and I am joining you from Alberta in Canada, which is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Stoney Nakoda, Tsuut'ina, and Métis Nations. And while we're waiting for people to fully join us, I encourage you to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and let us know where you're joining from. It's always nice to see kind of where people are coming from. And in this case, we have participants joining us from both the US through our partner, Climate Access, and also from Canada through the Climate Narratives Initiative. So welcome, very excited to be hosting this. We'll be using the chat function, as I said, to introduce ourselves, but the Q&A function, which you'll find on the bottom of your Zoom bar. I'm sure everybody is more than familiar with Zoom at this point, but just in case, in the bottom bar, you'll have the Q&A function. We did receive a lot of questions already for our panelists through the registration, but we'll be using that and monitoring that throughout the webinar. And we are recording, as you'll see, and we'll make that available afterwards. And then finally, we're always curious what people think. We really depend on, our participants to let us know how we've done and also what else you're interested in. So there'll be a survey that's pops up in your screen after the webinar closes, but also we'll circulate that afterwards. So without further ado, I will hand this over to Kara Pike, who will be the host and moderator for today's session. Kara is the Executive Director of Climate Access and certainly a pioneer in climate communications. So Kara,
thank you so much. Thank you so much. And it's exciting to see everybody joining and introducing themselves in the chat. Encourage everyone to do that so we can see who's in our room today. And I'm a Canadian and an American, so I can say about and translate any of that gets confusing today for anyone. And I'm in British Columbia on the traditional territories of the Cowichan, and excited to have such an amazing group of colleagues here today to share their insights with us. We really wanted to pull together some great minds from the US who have experience with elections, have experience with climate communications, campaigning, to share their insights on lessons learned from how climate became a main election issue, as well as a core pillar in the new administration's agenda. And what does this mean for the potential election that we'll be seeing this year in Canada, the federal election that could get called at any time? So what are those lessons learned that we can apply here? I think the conversation is really going to be useful for those joining us from the US and Canada. So I think it's really exciting to be able to have this opportunity to look back a little bit and also just hear what your thoughts are on how things are going with the current administration as well. So really looking forward to having the conversation. So let me introduce our panelists before we get started. Kunur Ojha is Chief of Staff for the Green New Deal Network, a diverse coalition working toward a just and green economic recovery. She recently served as the state's organizing director for Elizabeth Warren campaign, where she oversaw in-state direct voter contact, community organizing programs, grassroots leadership development, and more. She is originally from Illinois, but has traveled and worked all over the country building progressive power with volunteers and organizations. So welcome. So happy to have you with us today, as well as Mato Mildenberger. Mato is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research explores the politics of climate change in the United States, Canada, and around the world, Mato has published widely on climate communication and has developed maps of Canadian climate change opinion at the provincial and riding levels, which everyone can definitely check out. Maybe Maria or Amber can put the link to that in the chat so everyone can check out the Canadian climate opinion maps. So super happy to have you here. I think you speak Canadian and American too, so we'll be able to manage things okay today. And then my old friend, Jesse Tolkien, who's the founder and CEO of Drive Agency, a recently formed company dedicated to unlocking agency and change making in everyone from citizens to CEOs. Before launching Drive Agency, Jesse served as partner, chief campaigns officer, and executive director of Purpose Labs. Jesse has spent more than 15 years building people-powered movements from climate change to voting rights to women's leadership. She has specialized in unlocking new strategies and approaches to creating transformation and lasting change. And I know you're joining us from Brooklyn, but you're originally from Wisconsin, which I just also want to give a shout out. And Mato is originally from New Brunswick, although he's joining us now from California. And I think, Knor, you're in Washington, D.C. today. So welcome, everyone. All right, let's jump in. We have some questions for the panelists, but we definitely want to get to the questions that you have. We encourage you to start putting those in the Q&A right away. We also did get some, as Amber mentioned, some in advance. So, Knor, I want to start with you. The Green New Deal has been over a decade in the making and has greatly increased popularity in recent years. Can you tell us about the genesis and what you think were some of the key interventions that elevated the Green New Deal during the election?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I get into that, just thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be speaking with all of you, and yeah, just really excited for this conversation. You're right to say that the idea of a Green New Deal goes back a long time. You can see references to it in old documents that organizers who have been part of the environmental justice movement for a long time have been creating, in old Green Party documents. But the idea, and I think the brand, has really broken through in just the last few years. And really, I think it started to enter the mainstream consciousness just after the 2018 midterm elections, when Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was elected. And I think that there were a few different things that fed into that. And I'm going to try to do the short version of this. There are full-length documentaries being made as we speak about the genesis of the Green New Deal and about Representative Ocasio-Cortez specifically. But we were in the middle of, and are still in the middle of, a really polarized and heated media environment, right? This is just a couple of years after Trump's election. Even on the Democratic Party side, we're seeing a lot of party infighting with the progressive movement, really gaining a lot of power after Bernie Sanders' primary race. So we've got just like a really, a media that's really primed and looking for conflict. We've got a new underdog winner of this primary race that folks really weren't expecting to win. She was the first major victory who proved the theory of change of this tiny little upstart group called Justice Democrats, who really wanted to push for the realignment of the Democratic Party. Identify conservative Democrats who are maybe not super aligned with the vision of the progressive movement, and use primary elections to bring in folks who could advance the progressive ideals that they were fighting for. So when AOC was elected, this was really kind of the first proof of concept, the idea that the establishment could be threatened with newcomers with more progressive ideas. So we have this happening. And then at the same time, the Sunrise Movement is just getting started. They're coming off of more than a year of intensive planning and have got all of the plans in place for a huge action that they're going to do there's sort of an old understanding in the world of organizing that you do all of like the long, hard, slow work of recruitment and building so that you can mobilize down the line. The folks who were organizing with the Sunrise Movement were kind of flipping that theory of change on its head, right? Instead of organizing to mobilize, they were mobilizing so that they could organize, right? They recognized that if they create a really mediagenic moment, that they could attract a lot of attention and people would flood into their base and they could continue organizing over the long term. So they organized the now famous sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office, brought in this new member of Congress who all eyes were on, and to bring in this underdog and have her stage an action in Leader Pelosi's office was exactly the kind of high conflict thing that was going to get tons of eyes on them. So their base grew exponentially. They now have local organizers all over the country and have built a really well-sustained movement that can mobilize on an ongoing basis and really keep that drumbeat up. So a couple of years later, they had the infrastructure necessary to be able to mobilize during the presidential election. And they did the same thing that we talked about just a second ago, right? Recognizing moments, understanding what the media is talking about and taking advantage of them to advance their issues. So when they were engaging in the primaries, there were a couple of specific tactics that I remember that really raised the salience of climate in general and the Green New Deal specifically in the election. And one of them was Sunrise's scorecard that they created to judge candidates' climate platforms. It wasn't necessarily branded as like the Green New Deal scorecard or anything like that, but it was specifically designed to judge candidates' platforms based on Sunrise's priorities, which was known to be a climate movement. So they gave Joe Biden's platform an F-, and that was a huge statement. Suddenly everybody was scrambling. I remember being a campaign staffer and seeing policy folks really working to try and make sure that their candidate score was going to be as high as humanly possible. Another moment that I can remember was a sort of mini campaign that they ran to try to convince the DNC to host a climate debate. They didn't ultimately get that, but the demands were so widely heard and eventually seemed to be so popular that one of the networks hosted a series of climate town halls, spending a lot of time, primetime network television, with each candidate digging into climate policy questions. And that would not have happened without the organizing that the Sunrise Movement specifically did and that other organizations joined in on. So those were a couple that I could name just off the top of my head.
That is so great. Thank you for that context. And I can see how there could be a whole movie, but I really appreciate how you're able to provide that overview for everyone. I want to go to Jesse now. You've consulted with some of the leading social change organizations, working on a number of campaigns to mobilize voters, such as the New Voters Project and Power Shift. From your experience, what has changed in how climate change is being discussed and prioritized, and what are some of the factors that led to that?
So much to add to this question. I want to start by saying that when I first started working on climate change as an advocacy issue, as an issue that might mobilize voters, was when I was part of a really phenomenal group of collaborators when I helped launch the Energy Action Coalition and Power Shift in the United States in the kind of early 2000s. I like to mention that because as someone that turned 40 a week ago, I got my start as a youth climate activist. And I now like to tell people that I helped build the youth climate movement that might be almost equivalent of the grandparent generation of youth climate politics, because we've seen multiple iterations of youth climate movements which is absolutely incredible in the way that it should be. When we, and I promise that this is answering the question, when we were building the Energy Action Coalition, this is like 2004, 2005, 2006, you know, we had this somewhat radical idea, which you all will take as not being radical at all, which is that if we were going to build a coalition that was going to spur a generation-wide movement to battle climate change, we were in fact not just talking about the environment, we were going to talk about redesigning the economy. We were going to address issues of equity. We were going to need indigenous communities at the table, and we were going to need climate justice and environmental justice groups and future business leaders. And we were going to need to think about the strategy of big scale investments, et cetera. This was like way, way ahead of where climate politics were in America at that time. You know, we were just like a bunch of kids with like no money or resources. And then we started showing up at the grown-ups table, and the CEOs of environmental groups would say things to us like, you know, that's really cute that you're so idealistic and you want everybody to be at the center of the conversation, and that you want to make this about economics and you want to make this about justice. But if you understood politics, you would understand we have to be willing to compromise. So why am I like reliving this trauma / awesome heyday of youth climate activism? Because in fact, we were right. And when I look at the work that I am a super fan of right now in the Green New Deal Network, when I look at my heroes in the US climate movement that are the leaders in the Sunrise Movement, there was a fierceness of never giving up, that being able to effectively move the ball down the field on climate was going to be making sure that the climate conversation was a conversation about justice, making sure that the climate conversation was a conversation about equity. Pushing back permanently on what the opposition tried to do to divide us between organized labor, between indigenous communities, between farmers and ranchers, right? So what we've seen emerge in these past couple of years, what allows us to even answer the question how climate won in this last election, was maintaining the belief and the North Star and the understanding that it was never going to be about fighting this in a siloed way. It was never going to be about compromising before we ever got to the table on the ambition of equity and justice. And what I think is so profound about how even Joe Biden, and I'm going to acknowledge that everybody told me as a young activist that like as I got older, I would get more conservative, and I really pushed back on that idea. I said I'd be progressive to the end. But I have to say that I actually was a Joe Biden fan from very early on in this election cycle. Not because I grew more conservative or because I was complacent with the lack of ambition in his early climate plans, but I was a big Joe Biden fan because I saw the opportunity for a guy like Joe Biden to be able, with true authenticity, to integrate an economic narrative, a climate narrative, an infrastructure narrative together that I believed more accurately reflected how voters and everyday Americans live in the world, right? Because as activists and advocates and movement builders, sometimes we like to think, well, I'm going to go mobilize the climate people, as if like any human wakes up in the morning only being a climate person, right? Like we wake up caring about being able to breathe clean air and having a sustainable future, and we care about the education for our children, and we care about whether our family members have access to jobs, and we care about justice. And so I saw a pathway for a guy like Joe Biden to be able to integrate those things. And I think the climate movement, which thank God is not a static thing, it is a changing thing. There are new power players at that table. ultimately got wiser and wiser in recognizing the climate movement was not going to be a movement run by white environmental groups that got to decide whether or not communities of color got to play or got to decide where justice and equity. They understood that actually for the climate movement to become a movement that would have political power, the climate movement needed to expand and change and transform. And the politics have reflected that. Just one interesting thing I'll add, and there's just so many different directions I could continue to follow on this, is what cannot be underestimated in the way that climate has transformed in terms of the power that issue can have in an electoral context is the makeup of the electorate itself, right? Something that has been always so near and dear to my heart is recognizing and acknowledging the power of young voters, recognizing the power of voters of color. And for decades in the US context, the way that you ran a political race was to get a voter list and to cross out young people and to cross out voters of color because they weren't dependable voters, and to go to the same voters that turned up all of the time. And that's changed dramatically over the last 20 years, right? We know, this is shocking, if you target voters and you talk about the issues they care about and you ask them to vote and participate, they will in fact participate. And so the fact that it is off the charts how young people in America care about climate change, and that's not just true of young people who identify as Democrats, by the way, has changed the path of possibility in electoral politics, right? The changing demographics in America of who the electorate is has fundamentally changed this. Now, there's all kinds of attempts from more conservative players in America to try to cut that off, make it hard for those people to vote because they see that. But one thing that I think is so critical is winning on a climate agenda in this election cycle, in the past election cycles, and the election cycles to come, meant you have to be a champion of voting rights. It means you have to be a champion of getting people of color to have access and rights to participate. It means being a champion of young voters, right? It means being a champion of democracy. And coming out of those silos is so important. If we didn't win the special election in Georgia, we would not be having the victory lap we all think like we're having right now, right? So understanding the integration of these issues is critically important. I'm going to stop now. I'm taking up too much time, but if you can't tell, these issues really mean a lot to me.
It's super exciting to hear your perspective. And I want to go to Mato now and pick up a little bit on what Jesse was talking about in terms of the changing electorate. And I'm wondering, Mato, if you can just give us a sketch of that and what that meant in terms of climate in the last election and whether or not it influenced voting.
Yeah, no, these are all sort of great perspectives, and I'll pick up a few other strands that I think are really critical in making sense of what's been happening on the US side of things and why we had, the first real climate election in the United States, and in many ways why we have, the first climate administration that we've ever had in the US. So I think that there was, as and certainly, as both of you have already said, there was a lot of social activism and there was a real social movement in the United States around climate change for the first time. Previous rounds of climate activism have been a little bit more localized, or they've been dominated by a very sort of insider, sort of DC form of engagement over climate policy and climate politics, right? Partly because historically, the legal system and sort of adversarial legal conflict has been one of the main vectors that environmental groups have used to try and exert power. And, in the last, say, 4 to 5 years, as exemplified by sort of the Sunrise Movement and all of the great organizing that's happened around the Green New Deal, there's been sort of a vibrant social movement that's existed in sort of at the forefront of sort of the media and sort of the public eye. And that's had a really big impact on shaping the debate. And coupled with, I think it's also really important to talk about sort of the emergence of Jay Inslee as one of the candidates for president, and the policy shop that sort of Jay Inslee's group was running, that was putting a lot of sort of practical, ambitious sort of policy detail onto many of these ideas. So that suddenly you had, these very detailed policies coming out of the Green New Deal coalition. You had these detailed policies coming out of the Inslee campaign, and it resulted in sort of a competitive bidding between all the candidates that really came to the forefront during the CNN town hall that, Sunrise and the social movement was really sort of influential in catalyzing. And suddenly you had, candidates rushing one over the other to sort of bid up the sort of ambition of their climate policy plans, to have a climate policy plan as a discrete sort of campaign platform for the first time. And it sort of crystallized a trend that we've been seeing in public opinion for quite a while, right? Which is that over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, climate change and the climate crisis has become an increasingly important priority amongst Democratic voters. And one of the things we've been seeing, as we've had wildfires in the West and storms across sort of the Gulf, these experiences are being understood by Democrats as being climate related, and it's increasing their commitment to costly, ambitious, serious government action. That's not happening amongst Republican voters for the most part, with a few sort of exceptions, because many Republican voters are not understanding their lived experiences and the sort of disruptive experiences as being climate related. So you've had this sort of polarization, not just sort of in attitudes towards climate change, but also in the degree to which the issue is being prioritized and seen as central to sort of the political agenda of the two parties. But the result is that, like, within the Democratic Party, climate became a priority issue within sort of this cycle in a way that we've never sort of seen it before. And I think, we have to sort of credit the sort of the Green New Deal movement, the Sunrise movement, credit the Inslee campaign, and of course, acknowledge that the climate crisis is accelerating. And, we have 10 or 15 years to sort of solve this problem at the maximum. I think the media attention around the IPCC's 1.5 degree report was actually quite important in the US context. And this idea of like 10 years to act or 12 years to act end up being a really powerful rhetorical hook that many political elites and members of the public sort of hang on to. So I think that's one sort of set of factors that we need to think about. I also think that there is, we should acknowledge or think a little bit about how President Biden evolved over the course of this presidential campaign cycle in response to all of these sort of pressures and this organizing, right? So the initial climate plan, which Biden put forward early in the primary, was very ambitious relative to any climate plan that any presidential candidate had proposed in like previous years. But it wasn't as ambitious as the Inslee plan or the Warren plan, right? Or sort of the Bernie plan. And yet during the general election cycle, Biden actually increased and sort of, read the Democratic Party and sort of agreed with the Democratic Party's prioritization of this issue, right? And ran on a really ambitious climate plan, right? Targets like the net, clean electricity sector by 2035, right? And understanding of the need for investments in all sorts of different communities that had previously been left behind in sort of efforts to imagine energy transition. And Andrew Yang said something on like CNN during the convention, which I thought was really insightful, which he said, the genius of Joe Biden is that he takes any proposal which he puts forward suddenly becomes the reasonable center or the reasonable, moderate position. And I think there's a real sense in which he has become a credible messenger or to achieve a type of communicating credibility and moderation to plans that are deeply progressive and sort of deeply ambitious. And that's sort of, I think, been a surprise to a number of people in the movement, but a real asset of sort of his persona and his presidency so far. let me add one last thing. And I think that this is embedded in the logic of the Green New Deal, embedded in sort of the really exciting organizing that's happening right now, that sees climate changes linked to issues of racial equality and racial equity, sees climate changes related to issues of economic inequality, sees climate change as part and parcel of like a whole set of social issues that need to be integrated and resolved together. And that's that the climate policies that we're championing right now, the sort of the agenda that the Biden administration is pushing, the Green New Deal, right? These are policies that are focused on benefits, that are focused on imagining a positive future that is delivering benefits and good things for everyone, right? And it's a very different paradigm than sort of, the carbon pricing, carbon tax, emissions trading paradigm that sort of dominated a lot of the US thinking about climate change in sort of the late 2000s, right? Where it was a lot about cost and pricing, and sort of the debate was really sort of around sacrifice and loss. And even that wasn't true of the policies, but that was where the political rhetoric was. But I think the power of the new approach that's emerging in the climate movement, for instance, under the Standards Investment Justice Framework or under the Green New Deal framework, is a positive forward-looking vision about how everyone is going to benefit, how addressing climate change is a vehicle to address issues of racial inequities. Addressing climate change is a vehicle to address issues of unemployment. And I don't think we should take that lightly, because like that type of rhetoric and that type of coalition building and that type of policy making is actually categorically different than the way that climate policy was being debated and organized politically even 10 years ago. And to be honest, it's still, I think, distinct from the way that climate policy is being discussed in Canada, where I think the nature of the debate in the US and the way in which sort of organizing and political coalition building is happening, the US debate is further down that line than sort of we see right now in Canada. And I think that there's a real lesson to be sort of teased apart for Canadian actors to think about all the success that their cousins in the US have had.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that a little bit, but just to also note, if you check out the Green New Deal Network website, the main framing is "We deserve the good life." I love that, to your point about that positive vision. And you've all touched on the importance of this measuring stick. Like, what is the sort of bar for leadership, and how do you make that like a competitive thing? And I think in the Canadian context, we're already seeing that we're sort of lining up around who has the best climate plan. But there's a real, I think, challenge around, how do we avoid getting into false solutions or solutions that seem good but actually aren't enough? And how do you walk that fine line? Like with the Liberal government here, they've actually done a lot of very important things in terms of climate change, carbon pricing, a whole lot of things, but we're still, but then bought Canadians a pipeline with our tax dollars. But you don't want to, there's like a thanking as well as a holding to accountability, right? Like, you've done some great stuff, but here's sort of the bar for where leadership is. So I'm wondering, Kunar, maybe starting with you, if you could just talk a little bit from your experience around, as your sort of the candidate scorecard, right? And that grading, like, what do you really need to be thinking about to make sure that you don't end up in a conversation that is about false solutions?
Yeah, I think that the answer to this question might actually vary depending on what organization you talk to and what interests that you talk to. But stepping back and thinking about it, I think more strategically and tactically, I think the thing that I would say for any organizations that are concerned about that is to, like, first off, focus on the organizing and the infrastructure building in the first place. Those scorecards are going to be a lot more valuable if the person in power that you are wielding that scorecard against or using it as a sort of reward for knows who you are, knows that you have a base that's going to look at that, knows that you have media power to make that thing public. So regardless of what the thing is that you're advocating for or against, I would say like that is an important precondition to make sure that you're able to walk that fine line. This is something that we deal with all the time in our coalition, right? What is the right balance of advocating for something positive and then also making sure that we're setting up the guardrails to protect against something that we don't want to see? The carrot and stick thing, I think, is pretty hard for some folks, especially because a lot of activists, I think, have built power by clinging primarily to the stick. When you're on the fringe and you're excluded from conversations, that is one of the only ways that you can enter the arena, right? Is by banging on the door, by flipping the table. But once you've built a certain amount of power, it can also have the effect of eroding trust if folks think that you only have that one weapon. The thing that I think is sometimes undervalued by activist groups is also the dangling of the carrot, right? Helping people realize that, if a person in a position of power, if a lawmaker might go out on a limb and do something a little bit more progressive than they might be comfortable with, they've got these activists that are able to provide them cover for taking that position. They can go out and celebrate this thing and make it seem like it was possible because there was this groundswell and this demand for it, and really provide that protection. So that's something that I would say is sort of an important strategic foundation to be able to protect against, I think, false solutions in this context, but I would say, anything that you're trying to prevent and put up guardrails against generally. I know that's a little bit less specific, but I also know that folks hear the words false solution, and that's kind of a vessel for folks' different ideas. So I don't want to speak to anything specific there, but I know how hard that balance is to strike, and think that we often lean a little bit further towards the stick, especially when it comes to the climate movement.
Great, thank you so much. Jesse, I want to turn to you now. We've talked about, the genesis of this conversation, climate being tied to the economy, to equity, and now we have COVID as the other factor, and that is going to be a big part of the election here. I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts on how do we, so obviously there's this long history of the other pieces of the story coming together as one. What are your views on the intersection of those issues with COVID? And, how do you navigate that with sensitivity in terms of making those connections? And, we're at a different place too, where the vaccinations are not happening very quickly. They're here in Canada, there's spikes in numbers, and there's a definite fatigue from it all, in terms of where we're at on this. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do we begin to, really think about the health aspect of the conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, a catastrophic error that could be made is any posturing that puts COVID relief or a focus on continuing to take care of the health and well-being of the citizens of any country at odds with or in competition with investment we need around addressing the climate crisis. I mean, to me, that feels like a fatalistic error that can be made. The reality is that whether it has been consciously on the minds of citizens and voters or not, for the past 13 months in some parts of the world, 15, 16 months, we have been living in the twin crises of the climate crisis and a global pandemic, right? And it would be, one of the most important lessons you learn when you are becoming an organizer or a campaigner is the importance of meeting people where they're at. And I think we all would be fooling ourselves if we didn't acknowledge and realize that for most people, most voters, most citizens, where they're at in almost every corner of the earth right now is still living in a place where COVID is very front and center. It's front and center because your kid is still being homeschooled, because you're not vaccinated, you want a vaccine, you've lost family members, you've dealt with the economic crisis that has followed. And I think we have to keep that as a centerpiece. But the truth is that that offers also an incredible opportunity that I think, if dealt with appropriately, allows us to also seize potentially a once in a generation moment, because we have experienced economic devastation all around the globe as a result of COVID. We are going to have to spend our way, governments have to spend their way out of the economic crisis. I am not an economist by training, but I know that we actually have to have government investment to get the government rolling again. And we are on this absolutely critical timeline when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. And so that is why the opportunity for green recovery is so profound right now, that we might not, in fact, we are almost certainly not going to see the level of spending by governments that we're going to see right now in the next many decades. And so we either seize this moment to repair and rebuild our infrastructure, and we do that in a way that's about long-term health for our communities. That means everything from continuing to invest in research that means that we'll be able to have vaccines for future pandemics, but it also means cleaning up our energy system and investing in better transport. You know, in the current US context, it means seizing the moment to repair our absolute crumbling infrastructure. So I think what we're seeing, and the polling is suggesting all around the world, is there is appetite for this integrated recovery. I think there is a risk of climate activists being perceived as being too opportunistic if we're not sensitive to the actual emotional devastation and economic devastation that communities have felt. You know, it's really interesting because there's been a lot of talk about the name, the Green New Deal, right? The Green New Deal gets popularized. It becomes very clear very early on that the conservative opposition loves that folks have decided to call this the Green New Deal because they think they can like obliterate that. That's big government. It's government rule and spending over everything. Oh, good, we're going to take that down. So then there were a bunch of folks who said we shouldn't call it the Green New Deal because the opposition has gone crazy over this. I think my reflection in some regard is that the frame of the Green New Deal maybe just launched a little bit too early, because of course it was the New Deal that brought us back from the brink of the Depression and economic devastation in the US. And it was prior to the US experiencing the economic collapse that has happened during COVID, where now there's a recognition, a feeling, and internalization that we need something on the scale of a New Deal to bring us back. So I feel like in a lot of ways, the moment for the Green New Deal is ripest now. That language just came before actually people could fully like piece all of those kind of emotions and feelings together. One other just quick last thing I want to note is a bit of commentary that's currently happening about the US $2.6 trillion infrastructure package that the Biden administration has released. On some climate listservs, you see climate advocates saying, but how much of that is actually for climate? This isn't enough for climate. It's not enough climate first. And so you start to see, I don't know if I want to call them fractures, but real discussion amongst the extended coalition of is this good enough? Is this green enough? Is this climate enough? How much of this is false solution? And I almost just want to name that, because it gets to the point of like, what are the right coalition politics to seize everything that's in there, to push harder where we can, but hopefully not to blow the whole thing up? Because let's be clear, this is the biggest proposed investment in climate solutions we have ever seen in the United States. So blowing the whole thing up, fracturing the political will necessary to move it forward, in my point of view, would not be a wise thing. But you better believe we need segments of the coalition saying it's not enough. And we need of others saying this is really good for these workers, but we need something else for folks. So it's about recognizing that there has to be nuance in this. We don't all sing from the exact same song sheet, but we can create like a beautiful orchestra by all kind of like playing our roles.
No, I kind of want to push back on some of that a little bit, particularly the idea that the framework was rolled out maybe too soon, because one of my reflections in this current moment is that one of the things that we are benefiting from the most is the existence of such a strong grassroots infrastructure that is more united in its vision than we have seen in the past and is more strategic and savvy than ever before. I think that we would probably be struggling actually a lot more than we are now if that moment hadn't happened a couple of years ago. And I think that you're right to expose some of those fractures, but folks who were part of some of those conversations when the Green New Deal first exploded onto the scene in the most mainstream way we had seen in the last few years, was those fractures were much deeper, and they may have not been part of the mainstream conversation, thank goodness, but certainly there were sharp discussions and deeper fissures, I think, in the movement just a few years ago. And so I think having had the space before this incredibly consequential presidential election happened, to expose that conflict, to grow from it, and then to come through it even stronger, is one of the things that's going to lead us to come out of this moment even stronger. Certainly, that's one of the things that the coalition that I help manage is benefiting from the most. Right, one of our core theories was that we need to make sure that we have a more unified left than we have had in the past, and so we need to make sure that the folks who are trying to advance labor interests in this really tough time where only 10% of Americans are part of a union, for folks in the environmental justice community who are often underfunded and left out of these conversations and condescended to, are also part of the conversation before anything happens publicly, along with the climate interests who are well-funded and can bring the experts and some of their infrastructure into the game. And then some of the folks who are doing multi-issue progressive advocacy, bringing in folks who have other interests and helping them understand how they fit into the larger climate narrative. I wonder if, we hadn't had that framework, I wonder if we would have had it out and been able to come out of it, able to move in the same direction and position to push this infrastructure package to get as good as it can possibly get before we're ready to pass it.
I love that point, and I say yes to the framework. Branding is another question. The brand is absolutely right for right now, and there's just a question. Brand is a fascinating dimension of all of this, but you're right. I love the pushback, and I think the movement is 1,000 times stronger than it's ever been. Still huge open question in my mind. The movement is stronger, but what is the opposition really going to look like? I don't think we've started to see in full effect what our opposition is going to look like as we get closer. There's no question that a stronger movement is the best thing to have, as the hundreds of millions of dollars of opposition spending come out against us, but it'll be a really interesting thing for us all to look at. Such a fun conversation.
Yeah, I'd add one thing, which is just the movement in this case has the public on its side, right? And so, my team has done a lot of work exploring sort of the political logic of the Green New Deal, the political logic of, for instance, bundling green investments into COVID recovery packages. And systematically, you can show that, climate policy packages that also address inequality and also address sort of structural economic changes that are necessary are more popular, right? So including economic justice components into a climate policy package makes the policy package more popular. And in many cases, it makes it more popular for Democrats, of course, but it usually makes it a little bit more popular, or it doesn't make a difference for Republicans, right? So it's an entirely a winning political strategy. Same with the COVID recovery packages. I've done work in both Canada and the US, right? Looking at how are green investments received inside COVID recovery packages, right? And similarly, right, the public actually is responding well to politicians who are walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? And that's why I think that the current Republican effort to contest the Americans Jobs Plan that the Biden administration has put forward, on the basis that too much of it is not quote unquote infrastructure, right? Well, sort of a very confusing and poorly constructed argument in and of itself. It's also, I just not think, I mean, we see this in public opinion polling, but also in sort of very careful communication studies that think about how are green investments received, right? Green investments make it more popular in the same way that like resetting the corporate tax rate in the United States, recent polling has showed, makes it more popular, the infrastructure package. And I think many of those same dynamics exist in Canada. And it is worth pointing out that the scale of spending, that the Biden administration is putting into even narrow climate and energy related policymaking, which is almost $1 trillion. I think I saw like 950 billion or $1 trillion of the American Jobs Plan is sort of directly focused on the quote unquote clean economy. That's actually a much larger fraction of US GDP and sort of US spending and budget than even sort of the highest numbers that we're hearing about in Canada for sort of climate spending that might be part of sort of the forthcoming budget. So, the scale of action that we're seeing in the United States right now at the federal level, if it passes in any form that's similar to the current proposal, right, is going to be more ambitious than sort of even the ceiling or sort of the center of what is being considered in Canada. And I don't think that maybe it's appreciated in Canada how aggressive, right, the current climate spending effort is in the United States, and the degree to which Canada is going to have to up its game to sort of keep up.
Yeah, and I'd love if you can dive into that a little bit more, because I've just seen repeatedly that Canadians really do respond to where is Canada at in comparison to the US, like less concerned about where we're at compared to Europe. I'd always have the eye on the southern neighbor. So what's your thought about actually using that in communication to influence the kind of bolder leadership that's needed?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I thought that Canadian climate actors underutilized Trump as a villain in pushing forward sort of climate policy over the last 4 years. I think that there was an extraordinary appetite in Canada to not be like sort of the Trump-led United States in policy commitments and I don't feel that that villain was used to great effect in communication strategies, so that you're either with Trump or you're with this really bold, progressive, ambitious climate solution. And you can't vote against Trump because you're not a US citizen, but you can vote for this like amazing sort of progressive environmental agenda that's sort of repudiation of Trump. And similarly, I think that that sort of celebrating the US case in Canada and sort of positioning really ambitious Canadian action as sort of catching up with or sort of following in sort of the US footsteps could be a very persuasive message. Of course, it's not going to be a message that the incumbent government is going to be particularly supportive of, right? Because the Liberals have every incentive to sort of position the Biden administration as catching up with them. But I do think that there's value in sort of highlighting just how, at the same time as social movement actors in the United States should be pressuring the Biden administration to sort of and getting as ambitious and like effective a policy package as possible. I think that in Canada, social movement actors should be profiling this as this like major advance and this sort of major victory, and using that to pressure real change.
Okay, great. Thank you. I want to go, there's been some questions that have come up in the chat, and then we also got some questions in advance via the registration. And I'm going to bundle them because there were a number related to conservatives and whether or not there's an opportunity to engage conservatives on climate. That has been an ongoing discussion in Canada. That could be the difference. What I was hearing to some extent from all of you, though, is that actually maybe doesn't matter so much versus, you know, the point Kunar made about you really got to make sure the left is working together and, you know, let's actually move the people who are movable. So I'd love to hear from each one of you. Jesse, we can go to you, then Kunar, and then back to you, Mata, about this, because I think it's a really important question, you know, and it's interesting in the Canadian context because you really see sort of younger conservatives and conservative women in particular actually wanting to see climate action now. And you have the Conservative Party saying they're going to have, or at least the leader saying there's going to be a plan. So yeah, Jesse, first to you, and then I'd just love to hear from all of our panelists on this question of, you know, do we lean in, you know, youth, working with BIPOC communities, et cetera, get the progressives, or is there still a need to really be engaged, trying to engage on the conservative side? Jesse.
So I still firmly believe that we don't have enough power in our coalition alone to win. And in working in climate all over the world, the thing that I have found over and over again is we need to continue to expand where our base of power is to ultimately get policy over the finish line. And I continue to believe that's the case in the US. I think there's a difference between whether or not we will need Republican votes in the United States Senate to pass this package. That to me is a different conversation than whether or not we should be reaching out to more conservative citizens and individuals, constituencies, so to speak. I hope that they use budget reconciliation and they get most of this passed and they don't have to worry about whether they're getting a Republican vote. However, there are many members of the United States Congress who are paying very close attention to who in their districts are supportive of these things. And the extent to which those constituencies can go beyond the base that is core to our coalition, I think the stronger our support can be. And last year, I was a part of some research looking at Republican voting auto workers in Michigan and Republican voting former coal miners and coal related workers in West Virginia and Republican Latinos in Texas and Arizona. I'm just naming a set of constituencies where I think we identified all kinds of ways where there's common ground and we can continue to expand where the base of power is. Also, I would say in the United States, young evangelical Christians pose a huge opportunity for folks that are very pro-climate policy. They might not align on other political issues, but you could look at a place where Republicans in the future in a US context would start to have to veer away from climate denial to reach a new generation of voters. So this might not be a view shared by everybody. Let's keep separate whether you need Republican votes in the US Senate from do we need conservatives at large involved in supporting this agenda?
And I know I said I was going to have everyone answer that question, but there's been a couple of other questions that have come in the chat that I'm hoping we can touch on before we run out of time. So thank you for that, Jesse. And now, Kunar, if we could go to you. The success of AOC and many others was winning Democratic primaries and pulling the governing party left. Should organizers in Canada be trying to do the same so the Liberal Party, given they already have a winning coalition?
Yeah, I think the strategy should always be context specific. I am obviously really partial to the strategy of realignment in our two-party system. So I would encourage folks to grow the progressive base in their legislatures as well. I can't say that I know enough about the makeup of the Canadian legislature to speak in too much specifics about what exactly that would look like, but I don't think that it ever hurts to bring more progressives in and to also realign the dominant party. So I think for you all, can you pull the Liberals to be a little bit more progressive than they have been in the past? I know that we aren't going to go, or I know that we wanted to not maybe go around the horn on that last question, but I wonder if you could humor me and let me respond to that as well, because I think it's such an interesting question. And it almost feels eternal. I feel like I hear versions of this in every campaign, every different issue space. What do we do about the conservatives? What is the right strategy to approach that? Again, I do think it's context specific. In the US here, where we have extremely narrow majorities in both chambers, I think it is really tempting to say that we need to be thinking about conservative votes, and we need to try to win over some conservative senators. I agree with Jesse that is a totally different question from how we grow the base and the coalition of folks behind our solutions. But I would say in this context, where we have power right now, this is a base mobilization moment, and this is a moment where we flex our power and we use it to the greatest extent of our ability. I think it is really, really tempting to frame the terms of our debate based on what we are afraid the opposition will say or do, instead of maximize for what our base is going to be excited about and mobilize around. And this, I think, comes back to not being used to having this power and not being sure of what to do with it now that we have it. I think that it's super, super important that as we grow these movements and we build these powers, we really, really lean into it and use it as best as possible. I think it's really tempting, especially in an electoral context, just going back to that, since you all might have an election coming up soon. I think it's important to not frame things in terms of what your opposition might say, but to always present a proactive, hopeful vision, especially in times of upheaval where we have these intersecting crises that we've been referring to over and over again throughout this conversation. This is a stressful, anxiety-inducing time for voters for all kinds of different reasons, and it's so much more important that they are presented with a proactive, solutions-oriented vision that gives them hope in the middle of this crisis. And that will also be a magnet for all kinds of voters. So wanted to just add that note as well.
Great, I'm so glad that you did. Thank you so much for that. And Mato, I'm going to go to you for the last comment. Feel free to build on that, but if you could also maybe share your perspective on how do we address fake news and polarization in that, engaging conservative context. So we'll go to you for the last question. I appreciate those who are able to stay with us. We usually do try and wrap right on time, but I really want to make sure we hear from everyone one last time. So Mato, over to you.
Yeah, no, those are all wonderful comments and interventions that I really agree with. And this is a good question about sort of the role of fake news and misinformation in sort of shaping the attitudes that we all have towards climate policy. So I think there's a couple things to remember, right? First of all, it's worth remembering that the discourse we see from elites is not always representative of the public, right? So even in the United States, there's a lot more support within the Republican Party when you look at the data, even in very conservative parts of the country. There's acceptance of climate science and desire for action, right? That's inconsistent with what we see from sort of some of the political leaders in DC. That's evidenced by the support that, for instance, green investments have as part of the American Jobs Plan, when you're not going to see any Republicans in all likelihood vote for the plan or engage seriously with it sort of in Congress. And the same is true in Canada, right? Where there are, some of the rhetoric that we've seen by leaders like Premier Doug Ford to sort of oppose any form of sort of climate policy action, right, are inconsistent with like what we actually see when we look at like the distribution of policy preferences and attitudes that exist among, say, Ontario Conservative voters. So there's that disconnect. And partly that disconnect is a function of the role that powerful interests and fossil fuel companies and sort of, the people who benefit from the sort of status quo and sort of releasing carbon pollution into our atmosphere without cost, right? They have invested an enormous amount of money over the last 20 years, distorting both the public's perceptions directly, but also sort of distorting what our elites think about the public, right? So in research that like my lab has done, we can see that, people who get a lot of campaign contributions from the fossil fuel industry, right, are worse at understanding the pro-climate preferences of their constituencies, right? And so one of the really powerful thing I think that social movements in Canada and the US can do, right, is help reframe and help the elites in each country understand the actual distribution of policy commitments to climate change, even amongst sort of conservative voters, right? And so in some ways, I think the low-hanging fruit or the easiest way to start building this political coalition is not like changing the hearts and minds of like entrenched skeptics on the right, but instead helping our political elites to better understand just how much broad-based support there is, right, for this type of action, right? And in some ways, that's being revealed by like the bipartisan support for clean energy and other types of green investment in the United States. And it's true in Canada, right, where the intense opposition and rhetoric we're seeing from some members of the sort of Canadian conservative elite and like very active party membership, right, the type who goes to the conventions and votes down sort of climate resolutions, right, is not reflective of many conservative voters. And anything we can do to sort of help make that more clear and help push back against fossil fuel companies and special interests that are distorting sort of what is being represented as the conventional wisdom gets us closer to a world that resembles the 2020 presidential election and the Democratic primary, where Democratic elites for the first time were responsive to the interests of Democratic voters rather than sort of misperceptions that were structured by, coal, oil, or gas sort of propaganda.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I wish we had more time. We have quite a few questions that we just weren't able to get to. So I appreciate everyone for sending those in, and definitely drop us an email if you want us to connect you with an answer, some resources. I think perhaps my colleagues have put the roll-up of Canadian public opinion that we worked on, Climate Access with Climate Narratives, in the chat, which makes the very point that Mato just made about really reinforcing that Canadians are all in when it comes to bold climate action and normalizing that in our communications. So I appreciate all of your comments today. I learned so much. It was a super exciting conversation. Hope everyone who joined us found it that way as well. We will, as Amber mentioned, be asking if you could take a couple of minutes to do a survey, and the recording will be available on the Climate Access site after the session. So thank you all. So all of our panelists, everyone who joined for the conversation today, really appreciate it. And stay tuned, because we're going to continue having a lot of great content for Canadian and American climate leaders to get this moving along the timeline needed. So thanks everyone so much. Thanks to our panelists, thanks to my colleagues, Amber, Maria, and Chris, and thanks to all of you. See you next time.
Thanks so much, Kara.
Thanks,
Thanks so
Kara.
much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week. Bye.